Mayor Ed Koch called it the crime of the century. On April 19, 1989, a young female jogger was brutally beaten and raped in Central Park. Within days, 5 teenagers were arrested and confessed to the crime. They became known as the Central Park Five, and the crime and their subsequent trial both riveted and divided the city. Now, 30 years later, after the original crime, the memory of the media frenzy over the Central Park jogger case remains a flashpoint for those who lived it. Joining us now to talk about that moment in time in New York history is Pix 11's Marvin Scott, who covered the story as an anchor and reporter all those years ago. Marvin, welcome back to the program.
Good to be with you.
Absolutely. So, you were a reporter, I was a kid at the time, but please take us back to New York of 1989. What was the city like?
Tense. There was fear that permeated the city because crime was at a record high at that time. You had a crack epidemic, you had gang violence, murders. I think there were somewhere about more than 12 murders a week back then. So the city was gripped in fear at this particular time. And when this story developed, you heard what Ed Koch and others had said at that time. This rivaled any crime thriller back then. And 30 years ago, that story stirs as much controversy as it did back then. Because there are skeptics. There's the police. Police said they did their job meticulously, as Mayor Bloomberg had said at one point. And then the justice reform advocates say justice was served. This was all a rush to judgment. There were so many twists and turns in this story that occurred that Wednesday night on April 19th, 1989. Police made arrests within a matter of hours, and they picked up and charged, well, before they charged, they picked up 5 boys known as the Central Park Five, and they ranged in age from 14 to 16. They questioned them, interrogated them for 14 to 30 hours, as I remember the figure. And during that time, they kept pumping them for more details about the rape and the attack. The boys later claimed that they were deprived of food, deprived of drink, deprived of sleep.
And that kind of goes into one of the questions that so many people would have about a case like this is, why would they confess to something that they claim they did not do?
One of the reports that came out at the time was that they made a deal with police. Police said, look, you tell us what happened that night, we'll let you go home and everything will be okay. And reportedly the boys accepted that. And they provided stories, but there was something interesting about that because there were inconsistencies in the story. 5 boys, if they were involved in a crime, they all would have had the same tale, but they told different tales. And a couple of them talked about stabbing the victim, but there were no stab wounds on the victim. Interesting to note, too, police did not find any DNA evidence of the boys, and there was only limited physical evidence of the boys being involved in the attack.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that they didn't find any DNA from the then boys, eventually grown men, because they did find some DNA, and that's actually what set them free.
Well, that is what set them free. Now, initially, police at the scene did find DNA, did not match the boys, but it remained unknown DNA for about 13 years. That's when one of the boys, Kevin Wise, he was tried as adult and he was sentenced up to 15 years. He was serving time, I believe it was at Rikers, and he met a serial killer, Matthias Reyes. He had been in for a number of rapes. He'd break into apartments and rape women, and he had been convicted of a rape just weeks earlier in Central Park, and he was in now for murder, 33 years to life. Well, as the story would have it, Reyes said he found religion while incarcerated, and he felt Wise's pain. So he told him he did it. Now, they weren't empty words, because once police went to check, they corroborated his tale because they found his DNA on the victim. They eventually received $41 million to share amongst the 5. In 2012, I believe it was, documentarian Ken Burns immortalized them in a documentary, and in that he claimed that they were wrongfully convicted for one reason: racism. And there was much racism in New York in the 80s, in the late 80s. It was characterized as one of the most sensational crimes of that entire decade.
All right, well, the crime that continues to rivet so many New Yorkers, and thank you for taking us back to that time, because I think sometimes when we look back on some of these cases, we look back through it with the lens of now, and it's important to remember where we were.